He came home at 3 in the morning, still smelling like another woman's perfume, but the house was silent. The nursery was dark. The crib was empty. His wife was gone. His newborn son was gone. And the safe in his study, wide open. She left behind only her phone and a note with 7 words that made his blood run cold. I remember everything. Do not look for us. What did she remember? What had he done that was so terrible she had to disappear in the middle of the night? The answer will shock you. Stay with me until the end. Drop a comment if you think she was right to run, and subscribe so you never miss a story. The Tesla pulled into the circular driveway at 3:47 in the morning, its headlights sweeping across the manicured hedges of the Ashford estate like searchlights hunting for something lost. Preston Ashford killed the engine and sat for a moment in the leather-wrapped silence, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror with practiced precision. The faint scent of Margot's perfume still clung to his collar, jasmine and vanilla, a detail he would address with a shower before Caroline woke, assuming she noticed anything at all these days. The medication Dr. Cross prescribed kept her floating through the house like a ghost in expensive loungewear, present but not quite there. He checked his phone, 6 missed calls from Caroline, 12 text messages, each one more desperate than the last. Where are you? Please come home. The baby won't stop crying. I need you, Preston. Please. Preston deleted them without reading the rest, his thumb moving with the casual efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. She was always needing something. That was the problem with marrying a woman who had nothing before him. She never learned to stand on her own 2 feet. She never developed the resilience that came from earning your place in the world. He had given her everything. The house, the cars, the staff, the social position, and still she clung to him like a drowning woman, demanding more of his time, more of his attention, more of his presence. It was exhausting. The house was dark when he entered through the side door, the one that bypassed the main security cameras. Not that Caroline ever checked the footage. She barely remembered to eat most days, let alone monitor his comings and goings. But something felt different tonight. The kitchen was too quiet. The nursery monitor usually hummed with white noise from across the house, a constant background presence since the baby arrived 6 weeks ago, but the charging station on the counter sat empty, its green light dark. Preston loosened his tie and walked toward the hallway, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floors. Caroline, he called out. His voice echoed through the empty rooms, bouncing off surfaces that cost more than most people's annual salaries. No answer came back. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time now, irritation giving way to something colder. The master bedroom door was open, spilling darkness into the hallway. When he stepped inside, his hand found the light switch automatically. The bed was made. That was wrong. Carolyn never made the bed anymore. She barely got out of it most days, moving from bedroom to nursery and back again in an endless loop of feeding and sleeping and crying. Preston's chest tightened. The nursery was worse. The door hung open at the end of the hallway, a rectangle of darkness that seemed to pulse with wrongness. When Preston stepped inside, his hand found the light switch, and the sudden brightness revealed the thing his mind could not process. The crib was empty. No baby, no blankets, no soft mobile turning lazy circles overhead. Just a white wooden frame and a mattress stripped bare. Preston stood frozen for 3 full seconds, his brain refusing to accept the information his eyes were sending. Then something primal took over, and he tore through the house like a man possessed. He checked every room, every closet, every bathroom, every corner where a woman and infant might hide from a husband who had done nothing wrong, who had only ever tried to provide and protect. He found nothing. Back in the kitchen, breathing hard, his eyes landed on Caroline's phone sitting on the granite counter, not forgotten in a drawer or lost between couch cushions. Deliberately placed, centered perfectly on the cold stone surface like an offering. Beside it, a single note written on cream stationery in her careful handwriting. I remember everything. The baby and I are safe. Do not look for us. Preston read the words 3 times. They made no sense. Carolyn did not have the capability for this. She could not plan a grocery trip without his input. She could not choose a restaurant without his approval. She certainly could not orchestrate a disappearance with a 6-week-old infant. This was impossible. Then the real fear hit him, cold and sharp as a blade between his ribs. The safe. He sprinted to his study, nearly tripping over the Persian rug in the hallway. The painting that concealed his private safe, a Rothko reproduction that cost $40,000, was already swung aside on its hinges. The steel door hung open like a slack jaw, revealing the emptiness within. Inside, the shelves were mostly intact. His emergency cash, 20,000 in hundreds, remained in neat bundles. His passport collection was untouched. The Rolex his father gave him on his wedding day still sat in its velvet box. But three items were missing: the USB drive containing 7 years of financial records, every transaction, every offshore account, every creative interpretation of tax law that kept the Ashford fortune growing. The folder marked it cross-medical consulting, documentation of payments to Dr. Helen Cross that never went through insurance, records of conversations about dosages and compliance and management strategies, and the prenuptial agreement, the one that gave Preston complete control of their marital assets if Carolyn was ever deemed mentally incompetent. The one he had been building a case to invoke for the past 3 months. Preston gripped the edge of the safe until his knuckles went white, his perfectly manicured nails digging into the cold metal. She did not just leave, he realized, the truth settling into his bones like ice water. She took everything I need to destroy her. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a darker thought surfaced. One he would not acknowledge for several more hours. One he would fight against with every weapon at his disposal. What exactly did she remember, Peniton? 48 hours earlier, Caroline Ashford sat in the nursery at 2 in the morning, feeding her son in the darkness. The only light came from a small nightlight plugged into the wall, casting soft blue shadows across the rocking chair, where she had spent most of the past 6 weeks. The house was silent around her. Preston was at a conference in Boston, or so he claimed, a 3-day event for hedge fund managers. Very exclusive, very important, absolutely no spouses allowed. She had stopped believing his excuses months ago. The late nights that stretched into early mornings, the lipstick on his collar in a shade she would never wear, the way he looked at his phone with a tenderness, a softness in his eyes that he had not shown her since their honeymoon. But she said nothing, because saying something meant fighting, and fighting meant Preston would twist her words until she questioned her own sanity. You are so paranoid. Carolyn, this is exactly why Dr. Cross increased your medication. You are not well. You need to trust me. And she had trusted him. For 4 years, she had trusted him with everything. Her health, her finances, her contact with the outside world, her sense of reality itself. The baby finished nursing and Caroline settled him in the crib, her hand lingering on his warm belly, feeling the rise and fall of his tiny breaths. She loved this child with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes. This small person, completely dependent on her, was the only real thing in her life. She was heading back to bed when she noticed Preston's iPad on the dresser. He had forgotten it in his rush to pack for Boston. The screen was dark, but when she picked it up, it glowed to life. Still logged into his email, Caroline hesitated, the device heavy in her hands. She had never snooped before. Preston valued his privacy fiercely, and she valued peace. Every time she questioned anything, the conversation devolved into accusations of paranoia, into gentle suggestions that perhaps she needed a higher dose, into the slow, grinding erosion of her confidence in her own mind. But something made her open the email app. The first message was from someone named Margot Sinclair. The subject line read, "Last night was incredible." Caroline's hands began to shake. She scrolled through message after message, each one a knife sliding between her ribs. Hotel reservations at the Four Seasons, romantic dinners at restaurants she and Preston had never visited together, explicit photographs that made her stomach lurch, images of a younger woman with sharp cheekbones and knowing eyes doing things Caroline had never done with her own husband. The affair had been going on for 2 years, long before the baby, long before the pregnancy, long before the wedding anniversary where Preston held her hand at a charity gala and promised forever, his thumb tracing circles on her palm while she believed every word. But that was not the worst discovery. The worst was the folder labeled Caroline Management. Inside were emails between Preston and Dr. Helen Cross, the psychiatrist Preston had insisted Caroline see after she first expressed concerns about their marriage. Detailed discussions about treatment and plans, requests to increase sedation levels during the difficult postpartum period, notes about keeping Caroline compliant while Preston handled the business of their life together. One email made Caroline's blood run cold. Dr. Cross had written the current dosage should prevent her from asking too many questions. If she becomes suspicious or agitated, we can always recommend inpatient treatment. The facility in Vermont is very discreet. Just say the word. Preston's response was brief and businesslike. Perfect. Keep me updated. And increase the nighttime dose. She has been having trouble sleeping. Caroline set the iPad down with trembling hands. She was not mentally ill. She was being drugged into submission by her own husband and the doctor he paid to manage her like a difficult investment. Every moment of confusion over the past 2 years, every time she forgot a conversation or lost track of a day, every instance where Preston convinced her she was imagining things, where he looked at her with that patient, pitying expression and suggested she was not well, all of it was manufactured. Caroline sank to the floor of the nursery, her back against the crib, and sobbed silently into her hands. She pressed her palm against her mouth so she would not wake the baby, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. This was rock bottom. This was the moment everything she believed about her life, her marriage, her own mind, shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. But even as she cried, something else was happening inside her, something that felt like the first crack of ice breaking after a long and brutal winter, something that might have been rage. She reached for her phone with shaking fingers and began taking screenshots. Preston made his first phone call at 6 in the morning, pacing his study with the frenetic energy of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Dr. Helen Cross answered on the second ring, her voice professional and measured despite the early hour. Mr. Ashford, how can I help you? Caroline is gone, Preston said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. She took the baby and disappeared sometime last night. I believe she is having a psychotic break. There was a pause on the line, the soft sound of bed sheets rustling as Dr. Cross sat up. Did she leave any indication of where she might have gone? Just a note. Preston stopped pacing and stared out the window at the manicured lawn, still dark in the pre-dawn hour. She said she remembers everything. Preston let that sink in for a moment. Helen, I need you to prepare documentation of her instability. If this goes to court, I need comprehensive records showing she was a danger to herself and the child. Dr. Cross hesitated for only a moment, professional calculation evident in her silence. I understand. I can prepare a clinical summary by this afternoon. Her history of depression, the postpartum episodes, the medication compliance issues. Good. Preston ended the call and immediately dialed his attorney. The next 3 hours were a blur of strategy and contingency planning. Richard Sullivan, the family's legal counsel for 2 decades, arrived by 9 with a leather folder full of emergency custody motions. They discussed timelines, evidence, messaging approaches. Preston needed to be positioned as the concerned husband, the devoted father whose mentally unstable wife had endangered their child, not the controlling partner whose carefully maintained systems of dominance had finally failed. At no point did anyone suggest calling the police. Preston could not afford that kind of scrutiny. Not with what was on that USB drive. Not with the questions that would inevitably arise about Dr. Cross and her unusual billing arrangements. This needed to be handled privately, quietly, the way Ashford problems were always handled. 30 miles away, Caroline sat in a modest apartment in Stamford, watching the morning light filter through thin curtains that had probably never been replaced since the building was constructed in the 1970s. Her son slept in a portable bassinet beside the second-hand couch, his tiny fist curled against his chest, oblivious to the earthquake that had just reshaped his mother's world. Grace Holloway emerged from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and handed one to Caroline before settling into the armchair across from her. You look terrible, she said, without any particular judgment in her voice. Just observation. I feel terrible. Caroline wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. But I also feel clearer than I have felt in years, maybe ever. Grace had been Caroline's college roommate at Boston University, back in a different lifetime, before Preston, before Greenwich and country clubs, and the slow, systematic erosion of everything Caroline used to be. She was the only person from Caroline's past that Preston had not managed to eliminate. He had tried, of course. He found reasons to cancel dinners whenever Grace was in town. He criticized her influence, calling her negative and unsupportive. He suggested that maintaining old friendships was holding Caroline back from fully embracing her new life, her new social circle, her new responsibilities as an Ashford wife. But Grace was stubborn in ways that infuriated Preston. She kept calling even when Caroline did not answer, kept texting even when the responses took days to arrive, kept showing up at charity events where she was decidedly not on the guest list, just to see her old friend's face. 3 weeks ago, Caroline had finally broken down and told her the truth, that something was wrong, that she could not think clearly anymore, that she was scared of her own husband but could not explain why. Grace had listened without interrupting. Then she had given Caroline a burner phone in the address of this apartment. Just in case. She had said, just in case you ever need somewhere to go. So what is your plan? Grace asked now, curling her legs beneath her in the worn armchair. Caroline took a long sip of tea before answering. I stopped taking the pills 3 weeks ago. Right after we talked, I replaced them with vitamins from the drugstore so Preston would not notice the change. She paused, remembering those first terrible days of withdrawal, the headaches and nausea and bone-deep exhaustion. The fog started lifting almost immediately, and then I started remembering things. Conversations I had forgotten, events that did not match what Preston told me had happened, details that made no sense if I was really as sick as everyone kept saying. And the night you left, Caroline set down the mug, her hands steady now in a way they had not been for months. I found his iPad. I found everything. The affair with his assistant, the emails with Dr. Cross, the plans to have me committed if I ever became difficult to manage. She glanced at her son sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. I spent 2 hours taking screenshots of everything. Then I packed one bag, emptied his safe, and walked out the back door while he was in another woman's bed. Grace whistled low. Caroline, that took serious guts. No, Caroline's voice was quiet but firm, carrying a weight that came from somewhere deeper than courage. That took desperation. He was going to take my son from me. He was building a case to prove I was mentally incompetent, that I was unfit to be a mother, and I was too drugged to see it happening right in front of my face. They sat in silence for a long moment, the morning light growing stronger through the thin curtains. What happens now? Grace finally asked. I need evidence I can actually use in court. The screenshots help, but I need more. Carolyn reached for her phone, the burner Grace had given her, still strange and unfamiliar in her hand, and I might have found someone willing to help me get it. At the Ashford estate, Preston reviewed the situation with his mother over coffee in the sunroom. Judith Ashford had arrived within 2 hours of being summoned, dressed in Chanel and carrying the cold efficiency that had built the family fortune through 3 generations. She listened to her son's explanation without interrupting, her manicured fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the arm of the antique chair. When Preston finished speaking, she set down her coffee cup with a precise click against the saucer. This is what happens when you marry beneath you. Her mother was a school teacher. Preston, her father worked in insurance. What exactly did you expect from that gene pool? Preston bristled despite himself. That is not helpful right now. Mother, Judith stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds she had landscaped herself 30 years ago when this estate was just another property in the family portfolio. You need to hire a private investigator, someone discreet, someone who understands that certain matters require delicate handling. I do not want outsiders involved in this. Judith turned to face her son, her expression as cold and composed as it had been at her own husband's funeral. You do not have a choice anymore. She took your leverage. She knows about your arrangement with Dr. Cross. She has documentation that could destroy everything we have built. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. If Caroline goes to the authorities before you find her, you will lose everything. The company, the social position, possibly your freedom. Preston was silent for a long moment, the reality of his situation becoming clearer with every passing second. Fine, he finally said. Make the call. Judith pulled out her phone with the practiced motion of a woman who had solved problems this way many times before. I will contact Victor Lang. He has handled sensitive situations for our family in the past. What kind of situations? Judith's smile was thin and humorless, an expression Preston had seen many times but never directed at him, the kind that stay handled. That afternoon, Carolyn received a text message from an unknown number. I know where you are. We need to talk. This is a... Her first instinct was to throw the phone across the room and watch it shatter against the wall. Margot, the woman who had been sleeping with her husband for 2 years while Caroline lost pieces of herself she might never recover. But then another message arrived before she could act on that impulse. I have information about what he did to you. I want to help you destroy him. Carolyn stared at the screen for a full minute, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she typed a response. Why should I trust you? The answer came immediately. 3 dots pulsing before resolving into words. Because I am pregnant with his child, and I just realized he will never leave you. He will just keep both of us trapped in his orbit forever, using us however he wants. Caroline showed the messages to Grace. This could be a setup, Grace warned, leaning over to read the screen. Preston could be using her to find you. Carolyn nodded slowly, weighing the risks against the potential reward. Or it could be my only chance to get what I need. The coffee shop in New Haven was deliberately generic, the kind of place that existed in every college town across America. Brown walls, ambient acoustic music, the smell of espresso and indifference. Carolyn arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back exit, her son sleeping against her chest in a carrier. She positioned herself with a clear sightline to the door and an escape route already mapped in her mind. Margot appeared at exactly 2 o'clock, her punctuality as precise as everything else about her carefully constructed appearance. She was younger than Caroline had imagined from the photographs, maybe 29 or 30, with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes that suggested she had not been sleeping well. Her tailored blazer did little to hide the slight swell of her belly, maybe 7 or 8 weeks along now. She sat down across from Caroline without ordering anything, studying the woman whose life she had helped dismantle for 2 years. You look different than I expected, Caroline said, keeping her voice neutral despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. Margot gave a humorless laugh, short and bitter. Funny, I was thinking exactly the same thing about you. He always described you as fragile, broken, even, constantly on the verge of falling apart. She tilted her head, studying Caroline with new eyes. You do not look broken to me. Caroline kept her voice steady, refusing to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her pain. He made sure of it. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a long moment. 2 women who should be enemies, bound together by their connection to the same man, circling each other like wary animals testing for weakness. Why are you really here? Caroline finally asked. What could you possibly gain from helping me? Margot leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hands flat on the table between them. He promised to leave you. That was the deal from the beginning. After the baby was born, he said. Then after the custody paperwork was finalized. Then after his mother approved of the transition. She laughed again, the sound sharp with self-mockery. There was always another condition, another reason to wait. And now I found the emails about Dr. Cross. Margot's expression hardened, something cold flickering behind her eyes. And I realized that if Preston could do that to his wife, the mother of his child, a woman he stood before God and everyone and promised to love and protect, then he would do it to me eventually. I would just be the next woman to manage. Caroline felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The slow dawning awareness of a shared trap. What do you have that I can actually use? Margot pulled out her phone and placed it on the table between them. His office files are locked down tight. Everything goes through corporate security, lawyers, accountants who are paid very well to keep secrets. But his personal records are different. She scrolled to a photo of a server setup, compact black boxes blinking with green lights. He keeps a private server at the house. Everything truly damaging is stored there because he is paranoid about corporate espionage and outside hackers. And you think I can access it? I know you can. Margot leaned back in her chair. You still have your house keys. He has not changed the locks because it never occurred to him that you would have the courage to come back. Carolyn processed this information, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was examining for flaws. What do you want in return for this information? Immunity. If this goes to court, I testify for you. I tell them everything about the affair, about what I overheard, about how he talked about you when he thought no one was listening. In exchange, you do not name me as the other woman in the divorce filings. I cannot have that following me professionally. Carolyn studied the woman sitting across from her. 3 months ago, she would have hated Margot Sinclair with every fiber of her being. She would have imagined scratching those pretty eyes out, screaming at her in public, making her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused. But 3 months ago, Carolyn was drugged and trapped and had no idea who her real enemy was. Fine, Carolyn said finally. But if you betray me, if this is some kind of setup, I will make absolutely certain that everyone knows exactly who you are and what you did. Margot nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in her expression. Fair enough. For the first time since leaving the house, Carolyn felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that might have been hope. She returned to Grace's apartment at 5 o'clock, exhausted but energized in a way she had not felt in years. The meeting had gone better than expected. She had a plan now, a path forward, a way to fight back. But when she turned onto Grace's street, her stomach dropped through the floor of her borrowed car. The front door of the apartment was hanging open, swinging gently in the afternoon breeze. Carolyn parked crookedly against the curb and ran the last 50 feet, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Inside, the apartment looked like a tornado had torn through every room. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor, papers and photographs scattered across every surface. Grace sat on the couch in the middle of the destruction, hugging herself and shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. What happened? Caroline grabbed her shoulders, searching her friend's face for injuries. Grace, what happened? Are you hurt? A man came. Grace's voice emerged as barely a whisper, rough with recent terror. About an hour after you left, he was big, professional looking, expensive suit. He showed me photographs. You, the baby, the coffee shop in New Haven. He knew exactly where you had been. She looked up at Caroline with red-rimmed eyes. He demanded to know where you were staying. He said he would come back if I did not cooperate. Carolyn's blood turned to ice in her bones. What did you tell him? Nothing. Grace's hands were still shaking, but there was defiance in her voice now. I said I had not seen you in years, that we lost touch after you married Preston. He did not believe me, but he could not prove I was lying. He searched the apartment and left. Victor Lang, it had to be, Judith Ashford's fixer, the man who made problems disappear. They found her. In less than 48 hours, despite all her precautions, they had found her. Caroline pulled Grace into a fierce hug, her mind racing through rapidly diminishing options. I am so sorry, Caroline whispered. I never should have involved you in this. Do not apologize. Grace pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Just tell me what you are going to do next. Caroline looked around the destroyed apartment, at the scattered remnants of her friend's life, and felt the hope from an hour ago evaporating like morning frost in harsh sunlight. She needed to run again, but where she had limited cash and a nursing infant. Her only potential ally was the woman who had been sleeping with her husband, and now her one safe haven had been compromised. She was back to zero. The women's shelter in Bridgeport operated on the principle of anonymity. No last names required. No questions about why you were running or who you were running from. Caroline registered under the name Sarah Mitchell and found a narrow cot in a room with 3 other women, all of them carrying invisible wounds that matched her own. The baby cried constantly in this new environment, struggling with the formula Caroline had been forced to switch to when the stress of the past week dried up her milk supply. The other residents looked at her with knowing eyes. Some had visible bruises flowering across their faces and arms. Others had the hollow expression of people who had seen too much and could never unsee it. Carolyn realized with a sinking feeling that settled somewhere behind her sternum that she was one of them now. Her bruises were just invisible. Her cage had been lined with silk and decorated with expensive art. But a prison was still a prison, no matter how beautifully it was furnished. On her second night at the shelter, she tried calling Margot. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She tried again the next morning with the same result. The silence was deafening in its implications. Preston appeared on the local evening news that night. The shelter's common room had a small television mounted in the corner, volume turned low so as not to disturb the children doing homework at the folding tables. Caroline froze in the doorway when she saw her husband's face fill the screen, perfectly lit and carefully composed. He was standing outside their Greenwich home, wearing the concerned expression she had seen him practice in the bathroom mirror before difficult meetings. A reporter extended a microphone toward him. Caroline is suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, Preston said, his voice breaking with exactly the right amount of emotion. She is not thinking clearly right now. She may be a danger to herself and our son. I am begging anyone with information about her whereabouts to please come forward. Help me bring my family home. The camera cut to a photograph of Caroline, one from their wedding day 4 years ago. She looked radiant in that picture, happy, hopeful, completely unrecognizable from the exhausted woman standing in a homeless shelter watching her life burn down around her. He framed me, she whispered, the words barely audible, even to herself. He made me the dangerous one, the shelter director. A stern woman with iron gray hair and shrewd eyes appeared beside her. That woman on the television screen, she said quietly, studying Caroline's face with uncomfortable intensity. That is you. Is it not? Caroline could not bring herself to lie. Not to this woman who had dedicated her life to helping people escape situations exactly like hers. Yes, that is me. The director's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Our policy requires cooperation with the law enforcement in case involving potential child endangerment. I am going to need you to speak with someone from social services tomorrow morning. Carolyn felt the walls closing in around her, pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. Please. He is the one who is dangerous. He was drugging me. He paid a psychiatrist to keep me compliant. I have proof. The director's face showed a flicker of something that might have been sympathy or might have been doubt. I have heard variations of that story many times. Mrs. Ashford. Sometimes it turns out to be true. Sometimes the women telling it are genuinely unwell and do not realize it. Either way, I cannot take risks when a child is involved. She walked away, leaving Caroline alone with the television still murmuring in the corner. 24 hours. She had 24 hours before the shelter reported her location to the authorities. 24 hours before everything fell apart completely. Caroline retreated to her cot and pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She tried Margot one more time, not expecting an answer. This time, someone picked up, but the voice on the other end was different. Cold and distant, stripped of the conspiratorial warmth from the coffee shop. I am sorry, Caroline, Margot said. He found out about our meeting. I do not know how, but he knew everything. He threatened to fire me without severance, to destroy my reputation, to make sure no one in the financial industry ever hires me again. I cannot throw away my career for this. Caroline's throat tightened until she could barely force the words out. You are pregnant with his child. Margot, does that mean nothing? It means he agreed to provide for it. Generously? Very generously. As long as I cooperate with whatever he needs. The line went dead with a soft click. Caroline sat on her cot and stared at the blank phone screen, feeling the last remnants of hope drain out of her body. Her ally was gone. The shelter was about to turn her in. Her husband had transformed her into a dangerous lunatic on television. And in less than 24 hours, she would lose her son to the man who had stolen years of her life. She had nothing left. Caroline spent that night preparing to run again. New city, new name, disappear forever with her son before Preston's lawyers and investigators could find her. She packed the few belongings she had brought, counted her remaining watch, and searched online for bus routes to cities where she knew no one and no one knew her. She was zipping the diaper bag closed when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Unknown numbers had brought nothing but pain and disappointment for days now. But something made her answer. Some instinct she could not name. Mrs. Ashford. The voice was female, professional, and achingly familiar. This is Dr. Helen Cross. I need to speak with you. It is urgent. Carolyn's grip tightened on the phone until her knuckles went white. You are the reason I am in this situation. You are the reason I lost 2 years of my life to a fog I could not think through. I know, Dir. Cross's voice wavered slightly, cracking along fault lines Caroline had never heard before. I made a terrible mistake working with your husband. I made many terrible mistakes over the course of my career, but I have documentation now. Medical records that prove exactly what Preston asked me to do. I want to make it right. Why, Caroline demanded, pacing the narrow space between her cot and the wall. Why would you help me now after everything you did? because my medical license is under review for another case entirely. The state board received complaints from other patients, other families who noticed what I was doing. I am facing potential criminal charges, possible prison time." She paused, and Caroline could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven. "The prosecutors offered me a deal, testify against Preston Ashford, and my sentence is significantly reduced. So this is purely about saving yourself. Nothing noble or redemptive." "Partly, yes. I would be lying if I said otherwise." Cross paused again, longer this time, "but also because I have not been able to sleep since I found out what he did with the information I gave him. I see your face every night when I close my eyes. The way you trusted me. The way I betrayed that trust systematically over 2 years. I have done terrible things in my career, but what I did to you haunts me more than all the rest combined." Caroline closed her eyes, fighting against the war inside her chest. She wanted to hang up. She wanted to scream at this woman who had helped steal years of her life, her clarity, her sense of reality. But she also wanted to win. "Where are you?" Caroline asked. "Where can we meet, Doctor?" Cross gave her an address. A small medical office in Hartford, closed for renovations but still accessible through the back entrance. They arranged to meet the following morning at 9. The documents were everything Caroline needed and more. Dr. Cross spread them across her desk like a confession made physical, hands trembling slightly as she pointed to each damning piece of evidence. Medical records showing sedation levels far above any therapeutic dose. Emails from Preston specifically requesting maximum compliance protocols. Detailed billing records proving that Preston paid Dr. Cross directly, off the books, for services that were never reported to any insurance company. "This is explosive material," Dr. Cross said, sliding the folder toward Caroline. "Your husband was not just controlling you emotionally and financially. He was systematically incapacitating you, deliberately impairing your cognitive function so you could not recognize what was happening." Caroline flipped through the pages with trembling hands, seeing her own destruction documented in clinical language. Increased dosage per client request. Patient showing desired compliance levels. Recommend maintaining current protocol. "Will you testify to all of this in court, Doctor?" Cross nodded, something that might have been genuine remorse flickering behind her professional composure. "I have already given a preliminary statement to the federal prosecutor handling my case. They are very interested in Preston Ashford, very interested in the pattern of behavior these documents reveal." For the first time in days, Carolyn felt something other than despair rising in her chest. She left Dr. Cross's office with the folder clutched against her like a shield and made one more call. A number Grace had given her weeks ago, scrawled on a napkin with the words, "Use this if everything else fails." Patricia Eames was a divorce attorney with a reputation for taking abuse cases on contingency and destroying wealthy husbands in court. She was a small woman with sharp eyes, gray hair pulled back severely, and a record of wins that made her the most feared family lawyer in Connecticut. She reviewed the evidence that afternoon in a cramped conference room above a dry cleaner. "This is excellent documentation," Patricia said, tapping the folder with one finger. "This is the kind of evidence that changes everything. We can get your custody reversed immediately. We can get him convicted criminally." She looked up at Caroline, something like admiration in her expression. "But we absolutely need Dr. Cross to testify in person. Documents can be challenged as forgeries. A living witness, especially one with medical credentials who is willing to admit her own wrongdoing, is much harder to dismiss." "She will testify," Caroline said, allowing herself to believe it. "She promised me this morning." Patricia nodded slowly, already making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Then we file for an emergency hearing tomorrow. Let us see how Mr. Preston Ashford likes being on the defensive for once." The family courthouse in Greenwich was designed to intimidate people like Caroline. Marble floors that echoed with every footstep. Wood-paneled walls that spoke of old money and older traditions. The weight of generational wealth pressing down from every surface, reminding everyone who entered that justice here came with a particular price tag. Carolyn arrived in clothes borrowed from Grace, Patricia Eames at her side, her son in a carrier at her feet. Across the aisle, Preston sat with 3 attorneys in matching dark suits, his expression radiating wounded concern. Judith Ashford watched from the gallery, her face as cold and controlled as a winter portrait. Judge Martha Covington presided from the bench. She was known for fairness, which gave Caroline a sliver of hope in the otherwise hostile environment. Preston's lead attorney spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had won many cases in rooms exactly like this one. Your Honor, Mrs. Ashford is suffering from documented mental illness that predates the birth of her child. She abandoned her family home in the middle of the night, abducted her infant son, and has been hiding in undisclosed locations while refusing all attempts at communication. We are requesting emergency custody to ensure the safety and well-being of the minor child. Patricia stood, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite the expensive suits surrounding her. Your Honor, my client left her home because she discovered her husband was systematically drugging her through a corrupt physician. We have comprehensive documentation proving that Mr. Ashford paid Dr. Helen Cross to prescribe sedatives at levels specifically designed to incapacitate Mrs. Ashford and prevent her from recognizing his controlling and abusive behavior. She handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge with appropriate gravity. Judge Covington reviewed the documents for several long minutes, her expression growing more troubled with each page. The courtroom was silent except for the soft rustle of paper and the occasional cough from the gallery. These are extremely serious allegations, she finally said, looking up from the folder. I will need to verify the authenticity of these records before we can proceed further. Your Honor, Preston's attorney interjected smoothly. These documents could very easily be fabricated. Given Mrs. Ashford's documented mental instability, we request that Dr. Cross appear in person to authenticate her own records. Patricia nodded without hesitation. Dr. Cross is prepared to testify. She should be arriving within the hour. Judge Covington checked her watch and made a note on her legal pad. Very well. We will recess for 90 minutes. Dr. Cross will present herself for examination at that time. If she fails to appear, I will have to make my determination based on available evidence. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Wow. Caroline stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. This was it. In 90 minutes, Dr. Cross would take the stand and destroy Preston's credibility forever. The nightmare was almost over. She was heading toward the restroom, desperately needing a moment alone, when a man stepped into her path. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an unremarkable gray suit that somehow made him forgettable despite his size. His face was the kind you would never remember in a lineup, but his eyes were cold and flat, like a shark's eyes, empty of anything human. He said nothing, just handed her a plain white envelope and walked away before she could react. Carolyn opened it with hands that had started shaking the moment she saw his face. Inside were photographs, her at the women's shelter in Bridgeport, caught through a window with the baby in her arms, Grace's ransacked apartment, furniture overturned, the coffee shop in New Haven where she had met Margot, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens, and a note typed on plain white paper in a simple font that somehow made the words more menacing. Mr. Cross had a car accident this morning. She will not be testifying. Carolyn's legs gave out. She caught herself against the wall, the envelope slipping from her nerveless fingers. She stumbled back to Patricia, shoving the envelope into her hands without a word. Patricia's face went pale as she read the note. Oh, God. She was already pulling out her phone, dialing rapidly. She spoke in clipped sentences, then hung up with an expression that told Caroline everything she needed to know. Dr. Cross was found at 6 this morning, Patricia said quietly, steering Caroline toward a private corner of the hallway. Hit and run on a residential street near her home. She is in the ICU at Hartford General in critical condition. They do not expect her to regain consciousness anytime soon. 1 hour before the hearing, Carolyn's knees buckled completely. Patricia caught her arm and held her upright. We need to go back into that courtroom, Patricia said, her voice steady despite the catastrophe unfolding around them. We need to tell the judge what happened. But without Dr. Cross, Carolyn whispered, tears streaming down her face, we have nothing. The courtroom felt different when they returned after the recess. Smaller somehow, more hostile. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing down on Caroline's chest until she could barely draw breath. Judge Covington listened with a troubled expression as Patricia explained the situation. Dr. Cross was in critical condition following a suspicious accident. She could not testify today or potentially ever. Preston's attorney seized the moment with the instincts of a predator scenting wounded prey. Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of erratic situation we have been concerned about from the beginning. Mrs. Ashford's key witness conveniently suffers an accident hours before scheduled testimony. These documents remain completely unverified and should be treated with appropriate skepticism. Judge Covington's expression was clearly troubled by the implications. I understand the circumstances are highly unusual. However, without proper authentication, I cannot accept documentary evidence as the basis for my determination. Your Honor, Patricia pressed forward despite the odds against her. The timing of this accident strongly suggests foul play. We are formally requesting an investigation into the circumstances. That is a matter for law enforcement, not this court, Judge Covington replied. For now, I must make a custody determination based on facts that can be verified. Caroline felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, everything she had fought for crumbling away. Given the continuing uncertainty surrounding Mrs. Ashford's mental state, the judge continued, with obvious reluctance, and our inability to verify her claims at this time, I am inclined to order a temporary custody arrangement while we conduct a thorough investigation. Preston's attorney leaned forward eagerly. Your Honor, given Mrs. Ashford's documented instability, we respectfully request the child be placed with Mr. Ashford pending the investigation. He is the stable parent. He has resources for proper care. He poses no flight risk. No, Carolyn's voice cracked like breaking glass. No, please. You cannot. Judge Covington looked at her with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been pity for a woman who had already lost. Mrs. Ashford, I understand how difficult this must be, but until I can verify your claims through proper channels, I have a legal responsibility to ensure the child's safety. She looked at Preston, whose face was carefully arranged in an expression of humble gratitude. Temporary custody is granted to Mr. Ashford. Mrs. Ashford will receive supervised visitation twice weekly pending further proceedings. A social worker will be assigned to monitor the situation. The gavel fell like a blade dropping. Two officers approached Caroline where she sat frozen in her chair. Their faces were professional and detached. The expressions of people following orders they had followed many times before. Ma'am, we need to take the child now. Caroline clutched the carrier to her chest, her whole body curling around her son like she could protect him with sheer force of will. No, he is my son. You cannot take him from me. Ma'am, please do not make this harder than it needs to be. The baby started crying, sensing his mother's distress even if he could not understand its cause. Caroline looked across the courtroom at Preston, who watched with cold satisfaction barely concealed beneath his mask of concern. Judith was actually smiling. Please. Caroline's voice emerged as barely a whisper, raw with grief. Please do not take him away from me. He needs me. I am his mother. The officers were gentle but absolutely firm. They pried the carrier from her arms, and Caroline collapsed onto the courtroom floor, her screams echoing off the marble walls and wood panels. Patricia knelt beside her, holding her as they carried her son toward the door. She had lost. After everything she had survived and sacrificed, Preston had won. Grace's apartment was silent, except for the distant sounds of the city outside. Caroline sat on the couch, clutching her son's blanket to her chest and breathing in the fading scent of him. Baby powder and warmth and everything she had fought for, reduced to a piece of fabric and memories. Grace sat beside her, not speaking, just being present. Sometimes that was all anyone could offer. I cannot do this, Caroline finally whispered into the darkness. He won. He took everything from me. Not yet. Grace's voice was quiet but carried a firmness that cut through the fog of despair. You are still here. You are still breathing. That means it is not over yet. Caroline shook her head weakly. Dr. Cross is in a coma. Margot betrayed me. The court handed him my son on a silver platter. What else is there to try? Grace was silent for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. You told me something once, she said finally. Back in college, when I was ready to drop out because I failed organic chemistry for the second time, you said that the only way to truly lose anything is to stop fighting for it. Caroline closed her eyes against the memory. That was different. That was just a class. Was it really Grace turned to face her? Moonlight from the window catching the determination in her expression. You survived a man who drugged you for years without your knowledge. You escaped a house designed to be your prison. You built an alliance with his pregnant mistress. For God's sake, And you think you have run out of options now? The words hung in the dark air between them. Caroline thought about everything she had learned over the past weeks. The USB drive from Preston's safe, the financial records that could destroy him, the folder of evidence that remained somewhere in his house. And then she remembered what Margot had said at the coffee shop before everything fell apart. The real files are not in his office. They are on a private server at the house. He keeps everything local because he is paranoid about corporate espionage. Caroline still had her house keys. Preston had never changed the locks because he never imagined she would have the courage to come back. The Ashford estate was completely dark at 3 in the morning. Caroline parked the borrowed car 2 blocks away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows of the massive hedgerows that lined the property. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every step, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She knew this house intimately. She knew Preston took Ambien every night and slept like the dead until his alarm rang at 6. She knew Judith was staying in the guest cottage on the far side of the property. She knew exactly where the security cameras had blind spots because she had watched them being installed 4 years ago. The side door opened with her key, the lock turning smoothly despite her trembling hands. The house was silent around her, filled with the particular stillness of occupied spaces in the deep night. Caroline moved through the darkness like a ghost returning to haunt her own life, her footsteps soundless on the carpeted floors she had once walked every day. The study door was unlocked. Inside, Preston's private server hummed quietly on his desk, green lights blinking in the darkness. She plugged in the USB drive she had brought and began downloading everything. Files upon files, financial records spanning decades, emails that would make prosecutors salivate, contracts that would bring down not just Preston, but his entire network. The download bar crept forward with agonizing slowness. 60%, 70, 80. Then she heard footsteps in the kitchen. Caroline froze, her breath stopping in her throat. The download was at 92%. The footsteps came closer. Someone was moving through the house, heading toward the study with unhurried steps. 95%. Caroline pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard throughout the house. 98. The study door swung open. Margot stood in the doorway, wearing a silk robe that barely concealed her growing belly, a cup of tea steaming gently in her hand. Her eyes found Caroline immediately in the darkness. They stared at each other across the threshold. The download completed with a soft electronic chime. Margot looked at the computer, then at Caroline, then at the USB drive, glowing blue in the port. Caroline tensed every muscle, preparing to run. But Margot did not scream for Preston. She did not reach for her phone to call security. Instead, she walked calmly past Caroline to the alarm panel in the hallway and turned off all the motion sensors. "The back door does not have a camera," Margot whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have 4 minutes before the perimeter patrol comes around. Do not waste them." Caroline stared at her, trying to understand, why after everything, why help me now because watching you destroy yourself was supposed to make me feel better about my own choices. Margot's eyes glistened in the darkness. It did not. And because I want to watch him burn too, I just cannot be the one holding the match. Caroline pulled the USB drive from the computer and ran. The FBI field office in New Haven was not designed for comfort. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an institutional drone. The coffee machine produced something that tasted like burnt motor oil. The plastic chairs seemed specifically engineered to make sitting unbearable. But Agent Morrison, who sat across the metal table from Caroline, was very interested in what she had brought. "This is extraordinarily substantial material," he said, scrolling through the files on his laptop with growing intensity. "Offshore accounts in 3 different tax havens, wire transfers to shell companies across 4 continents, communications that clearly suggest insider trading at Ashford Capital over a period of at least 5 years. He looked up at Caroline, something like respect in his expression. "You mentioned your husband also paid a physician to administer drugs without your knowledge or consent. That constitutes assault at minimum, possibly worse depending on what exactly was prescribed. Combined with these financial crimes, we are looking at federal charges that could put him away for decades. What about my son?" Caroline leaned forward, her voice urgent. "The family court gave Preston custody. They have my baby." Agent Morrison nodded slowly, understanding the priorities at play. "If we arrest Mr. Ashford on federal charges, which we absolutely intend to do, the custody arrangement becomes legally moot. A child cannot remain in the custody of a defendant awaiting trial on serious criminal charges. Caroline felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in what felt like forever. How soon can you move? Agent Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter who had just been handed a map to his prey. How does tomorrow morning sound? The raid on Ashford Capitol happened at 9 in the morning, perfectly timed for maximum media coverage and minimum chance of warning. Carolyn watched from a coffee shop across the street as federal agents in blue windbreakers streamed into the building like a wave. She watched as confused employees were escorted out for questioning. She watched as Preston Ashford, CEO and scion of old money, was led through the front doors in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief as flashbulbs exploded around him. The cameras were everywhere. Every news outlet in Connecticut had received an anonymous tip about something big happening at Ashford Capitol this morning. Every reporter in the tri-state area was broadcasting live. Preston Ashford, CEO of Ashford Capitol, has been arrested on federal charges including wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy. The reporter announced with barely contained excitement. Sources indicate that additional charges related to domestic assault may be forthcoming as the investigation continues. Judith Ashford appeared on the courthouse steps an hour later, dressed in her finest Chanel armor, attempting to spin the narrative in her family's favor. This is clearly a political witch hunt against successful families. She declared to the assembled press, "My son is completely innocent of these absurd charges." But the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, and the story was only beginning. 5 days later, Dr. Helen Cross woke from her coma. Her first coherent request was to speak with federal investigators. From her hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines, she gave a videotaped deposition that destroyed any remaining doubt about Preston Ashford's guilt. She described in clinical detail how he had recruited her years ago to manage his wife, the specific medications she prescribed at his direction, the emails discussing increased sedation whenever Caroline showed signs of independent thought. She was being drugged into complete compliance. Dr. Cross said, her voice hoarse but absolutely clear. Mr. Ashford wanted a wife who would not ask questions, who would not resist his control, who would not recognize what was happening to her. I helped him create exactly that. It is the worst thing I have ever done. The emergency custody hearing happened the following week. Judge Covington reviewed the new evidence with fury barely concealed beneath her judicial composure. This court was deliberately misled, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. The previous custody determination is hereby vacated. Full custody of the minor child is granted to Miss Carolyn Ashford, effective immediately. Mr. Preston Ashford's parental rights are suspended pending the outcome of his criminal trial. Carolyn signed the custody paperwork in a daze, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. 1 hour later, a social worker placed her son back in her arms for the first time in 16 days. He was bigger. He had changed in ways that broke her heart to think about. Days of his life she had missed, moments she would never get back. But he was hers. Finally, completely, legally hers. And no one would ever take him away again. 3 months later, the apartment was small by any objective standard. 2 bedrooms with thin walls, 1 bathroom with temperamental plumbing, a kitchen so compact that 2 people could barely stand in it at the same time. It was nothing like the Ashford estate with its marble floors and imported fixtures and staff of 6. It was absolutely perfect. Carolyn sat by the window in the early morning light, feeding her son his bottle while the city woke up around them. Sunlight streamed through curtains she had chosen herself from a discount store, casting warm patterns across the second-hand furniture she had assembled without anyone's help. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Grace. Saw the news. 12 years federal. You actually did it. Caroline looked at the message for a long moment, letting the words sink in. Preston's trial had concluded yesterday afternoon. Federal charges for wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy. State charges for assault based on the drugging. Obstruction of justice for what happened to Dr. Cross. The judge, a woman with no patience for wealthy defendants who thought themselves above the law, had handed down 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. Judith Ashford had sold the Greenwich estate within weeks of the verdict, relocating to Palm Beach to escape the social embarrassment that now clung to her family name. The Ashford Capital brand was now synonymous with scandal and corruption. Margot had testified as part of a cooperation agreement, confirming everything about the affair and the cover-up. She had given birth to a daughter 8 weeks ago and was raising her alone in a small apartment not unlike Caroline's. Preston had never acknowledged the child. Cross had lost her medical license permanently and received 3 years of probation. She was reportedly writing a book about medical ethics and the physicians who violate them. She had sent Caroline a letter of apology that Caroline kept in a drawer but had not yet been able to read. And Caroline was here, in a small apartment in a quiet town, with a son who was learning to crawl in a future that finally belonged to her. She typed a response to Grace's message. No, we did it. All of us. There is something nobody tells you about surviving the worst thing that can happen to you. They do not tell you that freedom feels strange at first. That making your own decisions after years of having them made for you is terrifying in ways you cannot anticipate. That healing is not a straight line from broken to whole, but a winding path full of setbacks and small victories and days when getting out of bed feels like climbing a mountain. I spent 4 years believing I was broken beyond repair, that my mind could not be trusted, that my husband knew better than I did what was good for me, what was safe for me, what was true about me. It took losing everything to realize that I had never actually lost what mattered most. The ability to keep going when stopping seemed easier. The strength to take one more step when my legs wanted to give out. The courage to fight when fighting felt absolutely impossible. I am not telling you this story because I want you to see me as brave or strong or special. I am telling you this story because somewhere out there, someone is listening who recognizes themselves in what I went through. Maybe you know what it feels like to doubt your own reality, to have someone you trust convince you that you are imagining things, that you are too sensitive, that you are not seeing what you are clearly seeing. Maybe you understand the creeping isolation, the way controlling people remove your support systems one relationship at a time until you look around and realize you are completely alone. Maybe you have felt that particular exhaustion that comes from fighting battles no one else can see. If any of that resonates with you, I want you to know something important. Your instincts are real, your feelings are valid, and you deserve to be free. The path to freedom is rarely straight and almost never quick. There will be moments when you think you have finally won, and then something will shatter that victory into pieces. There will be nights so dark that morning seems impossible. But morning always comes. It came for me. It will come for you too. Carolyn put down her phone and lifted her son from the bottle. He was babbling now, reaching for her face with tiny fingers that seemed to grow longer every day. She laughed at his attempts to grab her nose. A real laugh, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of making. Your mama has got you, she whispered against his soft hair. Always and forever. Outside the window, the city continued its eternal rhythm. Cars passed on their way to work. People walked bows and pushed strollers and carried coffee cups. Life unfolded in all its ordinary, extraordinary ways. Caroline carried her son to the kitchen and started making breakfast one-handed, a skill she had mastered out of necessity. The coffee maker gurgled its morning song. The baby cooed and grabbed at the sunlight. The world outside grew brighter by degrees. Somewhere in a federal prison 200 miles away, Preston Ashford was waking up to another day of the next 12 years. Another day of institutional food and regulated schedules and the slow crushing weight of consequences he never believed would touch him. But Caroline did not think about Preston today. She refused to give him any more of her mental space than he had already stolen. Today, she was thinking about the apartment she might rent next year. Something with a small yard for her son to play in. She was thinking about the nursing certification exam she was scheduled to take next month. The first step toward rebuilding the career Preston had convinced her to abandon. She was thinking about the playground she had discovered 3 blocks away, where other mothers gathered on warm afternoons and children laughed without knowing how precious that sound was. She was thinking about dinner with Grace next weekend, and the book club she had joined at the local library, and the slow, careful process of building a life that was entirely her own. Today, she was thinking about the future, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future looked like something worth having, something worth fighting for, something that belonged to her and no one else. Carolyn smiled at her son, who smiled back with the uncomplicated joy of someone who had no idea what his mother had survived to give him this moment. Then she poured her coffee, sat down at her small kitchen table, and watched the morning unfold. One day at a time, one moment at a time, one breath at a time, free,